Hello everyone. Today we'll be discussing databases, more specifically the PostgreSQL and how it relates to Linux servers and as well as what is SQL. So let's get into it. So first let's actually discuss what is SQL. SQL or Structured Query Language is basically a computing language that is used in databases, and it has the purpose of being able to store and pull information of various types from a database and that users can access. These databases are used in many different areas. Businesses, schools, medical institutions can all use an SQL database to store uh, large amounts of information in that would typically be otherwise difficult. The information stored in an SQL database is in a row and column format, with the rows being an entire entity or entry into the database, and the columns being an aspect of an entity or category of the table. These types of informations can be anywhere from color, cost, identification number, or really any kind of information you want to store in a database. And here we can actually see uh, sort of the format that it's stored in, with ID, color, and cost being the individual columns that a database has, and below you can see an entry into the database, the row with 493938 blue and 2499 being a specific entity or entry in the database. With the information stored, a user can query the information in the form of SQL statements. These statements are used to pull and enter information, and they can be used to either pull an entire entity or just specific pieces of information from the entity. You are also able to store, create, and enter new kinds of information into tables or creating tables. And how you do that is just with the SQL language, which below you can see a couple examples of, such as the insert into, the desired table name, and the desired values. And that's for storing information. And then for pulling information from the table, you can use the select command along with whatever kind of information you're wanting to pull, and then you just use the from keyword and then the table name you're wishing to pull from. Now we will actually discuss what is PostgreSQL. PostgreSQL can be used on both Windows and Linux systems, and it is a database software capable of storing a wide variety of information, as we see with most SQL databases. It also functions like a typical SQL database in that it is able to make queries and pull out information from the database for either specific sets of information or an entire entry into the database. Most SQL databases are able to do so, just like PostgreSQL can, which is storing typical data such as characters, integers, Boolean values. However, it is also able to store larger sized information such as sound bites, pictures, videos, and typically data types that would require much more space. Some of the key features of the PostgreSQL software are as follows. The first is scale. PostgreSQL can support large amounts of information and users, which can be constantly pulling and storing information from the database without causing too much strain on the database. Next, we have buffers. PostgreSQL uses shared buffers to minimize strain on the server. These buffers pretty much allow users to access multiple entries of the same information, or just trying to access the same information at the same time, so that there's not as much strain on the server. And it also keeps frequently used information kind of in a buffer zone so that it doesn't require as much pull from memory as they are more often used. And lastly, we have processes. PostgreSQL uses multiple background processes to accomplish tasks such as backing up data and database cleanup. Now we'll discuss PostgreSQL Server and its conjunction with Linux and how to actually set up a Linux PostgreSQL server and set up a database. So this can be done either through the Linux terminal or just using the installer GUI, which will be the example we talk about in this slide, but it can also be used through the apt-get command in the Linux terminal. So the first step in setting up a PostgreSQL server with a Linux distribution is to navigate to the download page of the PostgreSQL through their website and install either the 64 or 32-bit version to your computer. After the download is completed, you can find the installer in your file manager, and just as discussed above, you can also install through the Linux terminal using the apt-get command. Once the installer has been executed, select the directory that you wish your database to be located in. This is where all the configuration files will be located, as well as your bin directory. And next you need to select all the components that you wish to have on your server through the PostgreSQL installer GUI. Next, create a strong username and password that can be used to log on to your database so that you can query the information, and then finally select the default port of 5432 that the database will use, and then select Finish on the PostgreSQL installer GUI. You are able to test the success of the installation by running a command on the Linux terminal, which is used to locate the bin directory of your PostgreSQL file. And that command is the ls command, where you use the -d option and then select the file path and then find your bin directory. Now we'll discuss some server hardening recommendations when using PostgreSQL with your Linux server, as we just discussed in the previous slide. So the first step that I would recommend would be to specify which ports you wish for your database to allow traffic through. So the default port of 5432 should be allowed through the firewall. This can be done using the uncomplicated firewall that's provided in Linux, and you basically allow traffic on the port of 5432 as well as the secure shell port of port 22. This ensures that unwanted users or traffic are not entering your database server through unsecured or untrusted ports, and can be done as discussed through the universal or uncomplicated firewall using the accept command. Next, you can use PostgreSQL roles. Assigning roles to the users of your database can allow for increased security, as it specifies what users are allowed to access and enter, much like a group policy object. It basically just defines who is able to do what on your server, and that creates more security as people aren't able to do things that they're not permitted to do. And lastly, we have enable row security. So enabling row level security ensures that users who have access to your database can only access their files or entries, so that they can't necessarily access, while they can access the table, they can only access their file and necessarily can't, pull data from other entries in the table or columns, or rows rather. This increases the integrity and confidentiality of your database and can be conducted by using the following command: alter table and then entering the table name, and enable row level security. Entering that will turn the value to a true and basically enable that this happens on your server and that users are only able to pull from the files that they have access to. And lastly, we just have a few references for this presentation.